"You need to grab your bucket and your rags and get off these steps immediately," the pilot sneered, blocking the cabin door with a stiff, uniformed arm. "This is a $60 million Bombardier Global 7500, not a shelter for strays." Vivienne stood on the wet tarmac, rain dripping from the hood of her simple grey sweatshirt, looking up at the man who was sneering down at her. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply reached into her pocket. "I said move!" the pilot barked, signalling for security. "Before I have you arrested for trespassing." Vivienne stopped, her hand freezing on the railing. A cold, dangerous smile touched her lips. "Captain," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the jet engines nearby, "you just made the most expensive mistake of your entire life. And the worst part, you're standing on my doormat." The rain at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey was relentless, a grey curtain that turned the world into a blurred watercolor of slate and steel. Teterboro was the playground of the elite, the gateway for Wall Street titans and Hollywood royalty who preferred to skip the chaos of JFK or Newark. Here, private jets lined up nose to tail like gleaming white sharks, waiting for their masters. Inside the VIP lounge of Signature Aviation, the air smelled of expensive espresso and leather polish. But Dr. Vivienne Dubois wasn't inside the lounge. She was currently in the back of a black Uber SUV, not a limousine, not a town car, but a standard Uber, stuck in traffic just outside the perimeter fence. Vivienne checked her watch, a battered vintage Casio that she preferred over her Patek Philippe. 2:15 p.m. She was late. "I'm sorry about the hold-up, Mum," the driver said, eyeing the luxury cars zooming past them in the authorized personnel lane. "GPS says another 5 minutes." "It's fine, David," Vivienne said, her voice calm. She adjusted the hood of her oversized Yale University sweatshirt. She wasn't dressed for a board meeting. She was dressed for comfort. After a grueling 70-hour week at the hospital, where she served as the chief of neurosurgeons, and quietly, the primary shareholder of the biotech firm that owned the hospital, she wanted nothing more than to fly to her estate in Aspen, drink tea, and sleep for 2 days. Vivienne was 45, with skin the color of deep mahogany and eyes that had seen too much trauma in the ER to be easily rattled. But today, she wasn't Dr. Dubois, the miracle worker. Today, she was just Viv. No makeup, messy bun, sweatpants, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. When the car finally pulled up to the tarmac gate, the security guard hesitated. He looked at the Uber, then at Vivienne in the back seat. He didn't see the billionaire innovator who had just sold a patent for $300 million. He saw a tired black woman in a hoodie. "Name?" the guard asked, leaning out of his booth with skepticism. "Vivienne Dubois, tail number N720 VD, she recited. The VD stood for Vivienne Dubois, a vanity detail she had allowed herself when she bought the jet last month. It was her first flight on this specific aircraft. She had upgraded from a smaller Gulfstream to the massive Bombardier Global 7500 to accommodate her family, though today she was flying solo. The guard typed slowly, frowning at his screen. He looked at her ID, then back at her face. "You're the passenger?" "I am," Vivienne said patiently. "Right, go ahead." He waved them through, but his expression lingered on skepticism. He likely assumed she was the nanny, or perhaps a personal assistant sent ahead to prep the cabin. Vivienne was used to it. In the stratospheric air of the ultra-wealthy, she was often invisible until she signed the checks. The car rolled onto the wet tarmac. Ahead, the massive bird sat waiting. The Bombardier Global 7500 was a masterpiece of aerodynamics, gleaming white with a subtle gold stripe running down the fuselage. It was a machine built for speed and excessive luxury. Standing beneath the shelter of the wing, checking the landing gear with a flashlight, was Captain Richard Sterling. Richard was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that built pilots. He had the jawline, the perfectly greased silver fox hair, the crisp navy blue uniform with 4 gold stripes on the epaulets, and the aviator sunglasses, even though it was raining. Richard had been flying private for 20 years. He had flown for Saudi princes, Russian oligarchs, and tech brothers. He prided himself on maintaining the standard. To Richard, the private aviation industry was the last bastion of true class. He hated the new money crowd, the rappers and the influencers who treated jets like party buses. But most of all, Richard hated disorder. He checked his watch. 2:25 p.m. The owner was late. "Unbelievable," Richard muttered to his co-pilot, a younger man named Liam, who was doing the pre-flight walk-around on the other side. "First flight with the new boss and she's late. These people have no respect for the schedule." "Maybe traffic," Liam suggested, shrugging. Liam was easygoing, happy just to be flying such a magnificent bird. "Traffic is for poor people, Liam," Richard scoffed. "If you own this jet, you take a helicopter to the tarmac. You don't make the crew wait in the rain." Richard saw the black sedan approaching. His lip curled when he saw it was a generic SUV, not a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley. "Look at this," he groaned. "Probably the assistant with the luggage. I told dispatch we aren't a moving service." The car stopped. The door opened. Vivian stepped out into the drizzle. She grabbed her own bag, a battered duffel bag that had survived medical school, and thanked the driver. She slung the bag over her shoulder and began walking toward the stairs of the jet. Richard watched her approach. He saw the sneakers. He saw the grey hoodie. He saw the messy hair. He didn't see an owner. He didn't even see a passenger. In Richard Sterling's world, people who looked like Vivian Dubois entered the airport through the employee gate, usually carrying mops or catering trays. He stepped out from under the wing, moving to intercept her at the bottom of the airstairs. He stood tall, crossing his arms, physically blocking the path to the cabin. "Hey!" he shouted over the wind. "You're at the wrong plane!" Vivian didn't stop immediately. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the rain. "Excuse me?" "I said, you're at the wrong plane," Richard repeated, his voice dropping to that condescending baritone he reserved for ground crew. "Maintenance and cleaning for the NetJets fleet is over at Hangar 4. This is a private aircraft. You can't be walking around here." Vivian stopped 3 feet from him. The rain was beginning to soak her sweatshirt. She blinked, processing the aggression. "I'm not maintenance," she said calmly. "I'm here for the flight." Richard laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of a laugh. He looked at Liam, who was watching awkwardly from the nose gear, and shook his head. "Listen, sweetheart," Richard said, turning back to her. "I don't know who sent you. Maybe catering sent a runner. But the owner is due any minute. I don't want you cluttering up the stairs. Hand the bag to me if it's catering. Otherwise, turn around." Vivian took a deep breath. She had dealt with difficult surgeons, hostile boards of directors, and insurance companies. She knew how to de-escalate. "Captain," she said, reading the name tag on his chest. "Captain Sterling, my name is Vivian. I am the passenger you are waiting for." Richard looked her up and down, making a show of inspecting her attire. "You?" He pointed a gloved finger at her hoodie. "You're telling me you're the principal passenger, dressed like that?" "Is there a dress code for owning a plane, Captain?" Vivian asked, her voice hardening slightly. "There is a standard of conduct," Richard snapped, "and I know the flight manifest. We are flying a Dr. V. Dubois, a VIP, not—" He waved his hand vaguely at her. "Not someone who looks like they just hopped the fence." "I am Dr. Dubois," Vivian stated. "Sure you are," Richard sneered. "And I'm the King of England. Now step back before I call security." The wind picked up, whipping rain against the side of the fuselage. Liam, the co-pilot, walked over nervously. He could sense the tension radiating off the woman, even if Richard couldn't. Richard? Liam said quietly. Maybe check the manifest again, or ask for ID. I don't need to check the manifest to know a stowaway when I see one, Liam, Richard said, not taking his eyes off Vivian. His ego was fully engaged now. He had made a judgment call, and men like Richard Sterling did not back down from judgment calls. This is a security risk. Teterboro security has been lax lately. People sneaking onto the tarmac to get selfies with the jets. He took a step down the stairs, looming over Vivian. Let me make this crystal clear. This is a restricted area. You are trespassing. I don't care if you're lost or if you're trying to hustle a ride. Get away from my aircraft. Vivian's grip on her duffel bag tightened until her knuckles turned the color of ash. Your aircraft? She repeated softly. I am the captain, Richard stated, puffing out his chest. On this tarmac, my word is law, and I am telling you to leave. Vivian pulled her phone from her pocket. I am going to make a phone call, Captain Sterling, and when I finish that call, you are going to wish you had simply asked for my ID. Richard snorted. Go ahead. Call your supervisor. Call the cleaning company. Tell them Captain Sterling kicked you off because you were harassing the flight crew. Vivian unlocked her phone. She didn't call a cleaning company. She dialed the direct number for Marcus Thorne, the CEO of the luxury aviation management firm that handled the staffing for her jet. Richard, Liam whispered urgently. She's dialing. She carries herself like she belongs here. Maybe you should just look at her ID. Quiet, Liam, Richard hissed. You're new. You don't know how these people operate. If you let them walk all over you, next thing you know, you're flying a party plane full of smoke and trash. We maintain standards. Vivian held the phone to her ear, her eyes locking on to Richard's. Marcus? Yes, it's Vivian. Vivienne Dubois. Richard rolled his eyes. Oh, nice performance. It's Vivienne. He mocked her tone. I'm at Teterboro, Vivian continued, ignoring the pilot's mockery. I'm standing in the rain at the bottom of the stairs to N720, VD. I am being physically barred from boarding by the pilot. A Captain Richard Sterling. There was a pause on the line. Vivian listened, her expression unreadable. Yes. He thinks I'm the cleaning crew. He's threatening to have me arrested. Richard crossed his arms, smirking. He was convinced she was faking the call. It was a common tactic for scammers. Pretend you know the boss. Put him on, Vivian asked. She pulled the phone away from her ear and held it out to Richard. He wants to speak to you. Richard looked at the phone with disdain. It was an older model iPhone, cracked screen protector. I'm not talking to your boyfriend, Richard said. I'm done playing games. He reached out, not to take the phone, but to push her hand away. It was a light shove, barely a touch, but it crossed the line from verbal to physical. Do not touch me, Vivienne said. The command came out with the force of a hammer strike. It was the voice she used when a patient was crashing in the ER and she needed absolute focus. Richard flinched, surprised by the sudden authority in her tone. You have 3 seconds to take this phone, Vivienne said, or I will ensure you never fly anything bigger than a paper kite again. You're bluffing, Richard said, though a seed of doubt had finally planted itself in his gut. Why was she so calm? Why wasn't she leaving? 1, Vivienne counted. Richard, take the phone, Liam pleaded. 2, Vivienne said. Richard snatched the phone from her hand, annoyed. This is Captain Sterling, he barked into the receiver. Who is this? The voice on the other end was not a boyfriend. It was not a cleaning supervisor. It was a voice Richard recognized instantly. It was the voice that signed his paychecks. It was Marcus Thorne, and he was screaming so loud that Richard had to pull the phone away from his ear. "Sterling, are you out of your mind?" Richard's face went pale. The blood drained from his cheek so fast it left him dizzy. "Mr. Thorne? You have Dr. Dubois standing in the rain? Are you insane? That is the owner of the aircraft, you moron. She bought the plane last week. She pays your salary." Richard looked at Vivian. She was standing there, wet, cold, and utterly unimpressed. She wasn't looking at him with anger. She was looking at him with pity. Sir, she didn't look." Richard stammered, his arrogance collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. "She's wearing a hoodie. She didn't have ID out. I thought she was—" "You thought she was what, Sterling?" Marcus Thorne's voice was icy now. "You thought she was the help? Because she's black? Is that what you're telling me? No. No, sir. Absolutely not. I just—" "Shut up," Thorne snapped. "Put her back on. Now." Richard's hand trembled as he handed the phone back to Vivian. He looked like a man who had just swallowed a grenade. Vivian took the phone, wiping a raindrop from the screen. "I'm here, Marcus," she said calmly. Richard watched her, his breath hitching in his throat. He waited for the verdict. He waited for her to scream, to demand his head. Vivian listened for a moment, then looked at Richard. "No, Marcus. Don't fire him yet." Richard let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "She's giving me a chance," he thought. Thank God. "I want him to fly me to Aspen," Vivian said into the phone, her eyes locked on Richard's terrified face. "I want him to fly the plane, knowing exactly who is sitting in the back. I want him to think about it for the next 4 hours. We can discuss his employment status when we land." She hung up the phone and slipped it into her pocket. "Get out of my way, Captain," Vivian said softly. Richard scrambled aside, nearly tripping over the stairs in his haste to clear a path. "Dr. Dubois, I am so sorry. I had no idea. I was just trying to protect the—" Vivian didn't even look at him. She walked past him, her sneaker hitting the first step of the stairs. She ascended into the warmth of the cabin, leaving Richard Sterling standing in the cold, wet rain, knowing that he had just boarded a flight from which his career would never return. But the drama wasn't over. The flight to Aspen was about to become the longest 4 hours of Richard Sterling's life. The heavy cabin door hissed shut, sealing out the noise of the rain and the smell of jet fuel. Inside, the Bombardier Global 7500 was a sanctuary of silence and cream-colored leather. The contrast between the cold, wet tarmac and the warm, golden lighting of the cabin was jarring. Vivian dropped her wet duffel bag onto one of the plush divans. She didn't sit down immediately. She stood in the center of the cabin, taking a deep breath, letting the adrenaline of the confrontation settle into a cold, hard resolve. She peeled off her soaked grey hoodie, revealing a simple black t-shirt underneath. She wasn't shivering from the cold. She was vibrating with a specific kind of fury, the kind that doesn't scream, but plans. From the galley, a young flight attendant appeared. Her name tag read Sarah. Sarah looked terrified. She had clearly been watching from the window and had seen the entire exchange. Her hands were trembling slightly as she held a silver tray with a hot towel. "Dr. Dubois," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "I am so sorry about the confusion outside. Can I take your coat? Would you like some hot tea?" Vivian looked at Sarah. The girl couldn't have been more than 24. She had the wide, anxious eyes of someone who was used to being yelled at. "Thank you, Sarah," Vivian said gently, taking the hot towel. The warmth seeped into her frozen fingers. "It wasn't your fault. You don't need to apologize for Captain Sterling's behavior. He is very particular, Sarah said carefully, trying to be diplomatic. He didn't know. He didn't want to know, Vivian corrected. She wiped her face, removing the rainwater. Tell me, Sarah, how long have you flown with Captain Sterling? 6 months, Mum. And in those 6 months, Vivian asked, walking toward the master passenger seat, a massive leather recliner that looked more like a throne. Has he ever treated a white passenger the way he just treated me? Sarah hesitated. She looked toward the closed cockpit door, biting her lip. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy. You don't have to answer, Vivian said softly. Your silence is loud enough. Up in the cockpit, the atmosphere was suffocating. Richard Sterling strapped himself into the pilot's seat, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He fumbled with the pre-flight checklist, his hands slick with sweat inside his leather gloves. Richard, Liam, the co-pilot, said tentatively. You missed the hydraulic check. I know, Richard snapped, his voice cracking. I'm doing it now. Just give me a second. Richard stared at the glowing instrument panel, but the numbers were swimming. All he could see was the face of Marcus Thorne, the CEO, screaming at him over the phone. All he could see was Vivian's cold, dark eyes staring him down. She's going to fire me the second we touch down in Aspen, Richard thought. My career is over. 20 years of flying, gone. I'll be lucky if I can get a job flying cargo in Alaska. Tower gives us clearance for taxi, Liam said, his voice professional but tight. He wanted no part of Richard's sinking ship. Roger, Richard muttered. He grabbed the thrust levers. He needed to get this plane in the air. He needed to do the smoothest, most perfect flight of his life. If he could just show her how good he was, how indispensable his skills were, maybe, just maybe, she would reconsider. Maybe she would see that while he was a jerk, he was the best pilot she could hire. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard spoke into the intercom, his voice trembling slightly before he forced it into his practiced, smooth, captain's tone. This is Captain Sterling from the flight deck. We are currently taxiing for departure. Flight time to Aspen will be 3 hours and 45 minutes. The ride should be smooth. We apologize for the delay on the ground. He released the button and slammed his fist against the center console. Stupid, he hissed at himself. Don't mention the delay. In the cabin, Vivian didn't even look up at the speaker. She had opened her laptop and was already typing. She wasn't working on medical charts. She was pulling up the background check on Richard Sterling. As the massive Rolls-Royce Pearl engines spooled up, pressing Vivian gently into her seat, the jet roared down the runway. Richard executed the takeoff with aggressive precision. He pulled back on the yoke, and the nose lifted sharply. Too sharply. The plane rocketed upward at a steep angle, forcing gravity to crush down on the passengers. It wasn't unsafe, but it was uncomfortable. It was the flying style of a fighter pilot, not a luxury chauffeur. Vivian's laptop slid across the table. Her water glass rattled violently in its holder. Easy, Richard, Liam warned in the cockpit. Angle of attack is too high. You're going to spill her drink. I'm getting us above the weather, Richard argued, leveling out abruptly. The sudden shift caused the plane to lurch. In the back, Vivian sighed. She picked up the cabin phone and dialed the cockpit. Richard saw the light blink. Cabin calling. He swallowed hard. This is the flight deck. Captain, Vivian's voice came through the headset, crisp and dry. Are we flying a jet, or are you auditioning for Top Gun? I have a glass of Pinot Noir back here, and I would prefer it stays in the glass, not on my upholstery. My apologies, Dr. Dubois, Richard stammered, his face flushing red. We had to clear some turbulence. There is no turbulence, Captain. The air is smooth. Fly the plane like a professional, or I will come up there and let Liam fly it." The line clicked dead. Richard sat in stunned silence. Liam stared straight ahead, suppressing a smirk. "She wants you to fly," Liam whispered. "I'd suggest you use the autopilot." For the next hour, the flight was agonizingly quiet. Richard sat in the cockpit, stewing in a mixture of fear and resentment. The fear was slowly being replaced by a defensive anger. "Who does she think she is?" he thought. "Okay, so she's rich. Does that give her the right to talk to me like a child? I made a mistake, a simple mistake." He convinced himself that he was the victim. He had been protecting the plane. How was he supposed to know she was the owner? It was an honest error. She was vindictive. That's what she was. He decided he needed to go back there. He needed to face her. Not as a groveling servant, but as a man. He would explain the security protocols. He would use big words and technical jargon. He would explain that his aggression was actually a sign of his dedication to her safety. She would have to respect that. "Liam, you have the controls," Richard said, unbuckling his harness. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Liam asked. "I need to check on the passenger," Richard said, adjusting his tie and putting his hat back on. He checked his reflection in the darkened glass of the side window. He looked the part. He just needed to sell it. Richard opened the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. Vivian was reclined, reading a medical journal. She didn't look up when he entered. Richard cleared his throat. "Dr. Dubois." Vivian turned a page. "Captain." "Who is flying my plane?" "First Officer Liam is fully qualified," Richard said, stepping closer. He adopted a stance he used on difficult clients, feet apart, hands clasped behind his back, authoritative. "I wanted to speak with you regarding the incident on the tarmac." Vivian finally looked up. Her eyes were unreadable. "I thought we were discussing that in Aspen." "I feel it needs to be addressed now," Richard said, his confidence returning. "You see, Dr. Dubois, we have strict protocols regarding tarmac security. In this day and age, with threats being what they are, we have to profile behavior. Someone approaching the aircraft without visible badges, dressed in casual attire, it triggers a threat response. My actions were dictated by the manual." He smiled, a tight, practiced smile. "I was essentially doing my job too well. I hope you can understand that my priority is the safety of this vessel." Vivian stared at him for a long moment. Then she closed the journal and placed it on the table. "That was a very eloquent speech, Richard," she said. "Thank you, Mum. However," she continued, "I just got off the phone with the FBO manager at Teterboro. He told me that 3 weeks ago, a young white man, a YouTuber, I believe, jumped the fence to film a prank video. He ran right up to the stairs of a Gulf Stream you were prepping." Richard froze. "Do you recall that incident?" Vivian asked. "Aye. Vaguely." "The report says you took a selfie with him," Vivian said, her voice dropping an octave. "You didn't call security. You didn't block him. You laughed, took a photo, and then politely asked him to leave. He was wearing a t-shirt and ripped jeans. He had no ID." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "So," Vivian stood up, walking toward him. She was shorter than him, but in that moment she seemed 10 feet tall. "Don't stand there and lie to me about security protocols and manuals. You didn't stop me because of safety. You stopped me because you looked at me and decided I didn't belong in your world. You decided I was beneath you." "Dr. Dubois, Go back to the cockpit, Richard," she ordered, pointing to the door. "And shut the door. If I see you again before we land, I won't just fire you. I will sue you for breach of contract and negligence. Do not test me." Richard turned and fled. He practically ran back into the cockpit, slamming the door behind him, his face burning with a shame so hot it felt like a physical burn. He had tried to play the hero, and she had exposed him as a hypocrite in less than a minute. 2 hours into the flight, the atmosphere in the plane had shifted from tense to ominous. The sun had set, and the sky outside was a deep, bruised purple. Vivienne was restless. The interaction with Richard had left a sour taste in her mouth. She needed to stretch her legs. She walked to the back of the plane, past the galley where Sarah was quietly organizing snacks, and into the rear stateroom. The Bombardier Global 7500 featured a private bedroom at the back, complete with a queen-sized bed and an ensuite bathroom. It was the primary reason Vivienne had bought the jet, so she could sleep on flights to conferences in Europe. She entered the bedroom and flicked on the lights. It was immaculate. Sarah had clearly prepped it perfectly. Vivienne sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. She looked around the room, admiring the mahogany trim. Her eyes landed on the storage credenza at the foot of the bed. It was a beautiful piece of cabinetry, designed to hold blankets and pillows. However, something was wrong. One of the cabinet doors was slightly ajar. A small sliver of plastic was jammed in the hinge, preventing it from closing flush. Vivienne, possessing the meticulous eye of a neurosurgeon, noticed it immediately. She walked over and knelt down. She pulled the plastic out. It was a corner of a thick Ziploc bag. She frowned. She opened the cabinet door. Inside, instead of extra cashmere blankets, there were 3 large black hard-shell cases. They were pelican cases, the kind used for camera equipment or delicate instruments. They were shoved deep into the back, hidden behind a row of pillows. Vivienne's heart rate picked up. This was her plane. She hadn't put those there. She pulled the first case out. It was heavy. There was a padlock on the handle, but it wasn't clicked shut. Whoever had stashed it here had been in a rush. She flipped the latches and opened the lid. Vivienne gasped. Nestled in custom-cut foam were 12 watches. But these weren't just watches. Even with her limited knowledge of horology, she recognized the brands. Patek Philippe, Richard Mille, Rolex Daytonas. Some were encrusted with diamonds, others were rare vintage models. She pulled out her phone and snapped a photo, then did a quick Google Lens search on one of the Richard Mille watches. Estimated value, $350,000. There were 12 in this box alone, and there were 3 boxes. She did the mental math. This was nearly $10 million worth of merchandise. "What are you doing, Richard?" she whispered to herself. She quickly realized what this was. Smuggling. He was using the private jet to bypass customs. Private terminals often had much more relaxed customs screenings than commercial flights, especially for the flight crew. If the pilot carried a bag off, nobody questioned it. He was using her plane, her fuel, and her liability insurance to run a multi-million-dollar smuggling ring. A sudden lurch of the plane made the case slide across the floor. The fasten seatbelt light dinged on. "Folks, we have some chop ahead," Richard's voice came over the intercom. He sounded strained. "Please take your seats." Vivienne didn't take her seat. She stared at the watches. This changed everything. This wasn't just about a rude pilot anymore. This was a federal crime taking place at 40,000 feet. Suddenly, the door to the bedroom opened. Vivienne spun around. It wasn't Sarah. It was Richard. He had come back to check the cargo. He must have realized he hadn't locked the cabinet properly, or perhaps he was just paranoid. Richard froze in the doorway. His eyes went from Vivienne's face to the open case on the floor, and then to the other 2 cases, still in the cabinet. The color drained from his face instantly, leaving him looking like a corpse. His aviator swagger was gone. In its place was the raw, primal terror of a man who knows he has just been caught holding the smoking gun. "Dr. Dubois," Richard croaked. He took a step into the room, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot. "Stay right there," Vivienne said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. She stood up, putting the heavy case between them like a shield. "Don't take another step." "You weren't supposed to look in there," Richard said, his voice trembling. He looked frantic. He looked at the window, then back at her. "Those are personal effects. I was transporting them for a friend." "A friend?" Vivienne scoffed. $10 million in undeclared luxury watches, hidden in the owner's suite. You're a mule, Richard, or worse. "Listen to me," Richard said, taking another step forward. His hands were raised, but his eyes were desperate. "You don't understand. I owe people. Bad people. I had to do this. This is the last run, I swear." "I don't care who you owe," Vivienne said. "Get out of this room." "I can't let you call anyone," Richard said. The desperation in his voice spiked. He wasn't thinking clearly. The turbulence bumped the plane again, throwing him off balance, but he regained his footing. "Dr. Dubois, please. We land in Aspen. I take the bags. You never saw them. I disappear. You never see me again. Please." "You want me to be an accomplice to a felony?" Vivienne asked, inching toward the bedside phone. "I'm not asking," Richard shouted, his facade completely shattering. "I'm telling you. If I go down for this, I lose everything. I'm not going to jail." He lunged toward the cases. "Richard!" The shout came from the intercom speakers overhead, loud and urgent. It was Liam from the cockpit. "Richard, get back here. Autopilot just disconnected. We have an engine indication on number 2. Richard!" The plane banked violently to the left. The floor tilted at a crazy 45-degree angle. The case of watches slid across the room and slammed into the wall, spilling $500,000 timepieces onto the carpet. Richard was thrown against the doorframe. Vivienne grabbed the headboard of the bed to stop herself from falling. "The engine!" Richard gasped. The pilot instinct kicked in, warring with his criminal panic. "Number 2! Go!" Vivienne screamed at him, pointing at the cockpit. "Fly the damn plane, Richard. If we crash, the watches won't matter." Richard looked at the spilled watches, then at Vivienne, and finally at the ceiling where Liam was shouting through the speaker. "Richard, I'm losing altitude. I need you." Self-preservation won. Richard turned and scrambled out of the bedroom, running uphill against the tilt of the floor, back toward the cockpit. Vivienne fell back onto the bed as the G-forces increased. The plane was entering a steep dive. She could hear the roar of the engines changing pitch. One was screaming, the other was sputtering. She grabbed the phone, but the line was dead. She was trapped in the back of a diving metal tube with a pilot who was not only incompetent and racist, but also a desperate criminal. Vivienne Dubois closed her eyes and did the only thing she could do. She prayed, and she swore that if she survived the next 20 minutes, Richard Sterling would pay for every single second of this flight. The cockpit of the Bombardier Global 7500 was a cacophony of alarms. The master warning light pulsed a terrifying red, illuminating the sweat that was now streaming down Richard Sterling's face. "Engine failure on number 2, Liam shouted, his voice cracking, but his hands flying across the overhead panel. "N1 is dropping to 0. EGT is spiking. Fire suppression armed." Richard gripped the yoke so hard the leather groaned. His mind was fractured. Half of his brain was trying to process the complex aerodynamics of a single-engine operation in a heavy jet. The other half was screaming about the 3 cases of stolen luxury watches sitting in the owner's bedroom. "Richard, feather the prop. Shut down the fuel flow," Liam corrected himself, panic seeping into his training. "Richard, do you hear me?" "I hear you," Richard snapped. He looked out the windshield. Night had fallen completely. Below them, the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Colorado Rockies were invisible in the dark, but the synthetic vision system on the primary flight display showed them as terrifying wireframe ghosts rising up to meet them. Aspen-Pitkin County Airport, KSE, was one of the most dangerous airports in the United States for private aviation. At an elevation of nearly 8,000 feet, surrounded by steep terrain on 3 sides, it required a steep, aggressive approach. To attempt it at night, with one engine out, while mentally unraveling, was a death sentence. "We can't make Aspen," Richard muttered. "We need to divert to Rifle or Denver." "We don't have the altitude to clear the pass if we turn back," Liam argued, pointing at the terrain map. "We are committed, Captain. We have to shoot the approach now." In the cabin, the silence was worse than the noise. The constant ding-ding-ding of the intercom chimes had stopped. The plane was shuddering violently, a sensation like driving a sports car over a cobblestone road at 100 miles an hour. Vivian sat strapped into the divan seat, having crawled back from the bedroom. She had the heavy Pelican case of watches clamped between her legs, her arms wrapped around it. She wasn't protecting the watches, she was securing the evidence. Across the aisle, Sarah, the young flight attendant, was strapped into her jump seat, sobbing quietly into her hands. "Look at me, Sarah," Vivienne said. Her voice was steady, anchoring the room. Sarah looked up, mascara running down her cheeks. "We are going to be fine," Vivienne lied. She didn't know if they would be fine, but she knew that panic killed faster than gravity. "This jet is built to fly on one engine. It can glide for 100 miles if it has to. Just breathe." "I don't want to die," Sarah whispered. "You're not going to die," Vivienne said. "But when we land, I need you to be brave. Can you do that for me?" Sarah nodded, wiping her nose. Back in the cockpit, the runway lights of Aspen finally pierced the gloom, a faint string of pearls in a sea of black ink. "I have the runway," Richard said. His breathing was shallow. "Flaps 30. "Flaps 30, Liam confirmed. "Speed checks. Gear down." The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud, dragging the plane's airspeed down. The single working engine screamed as Richard pushed the throttle forward to compensate for the drag. The plane yawed to the left, fighting the asymmetry. "You're too low, Richard," Liam warned, his eyes glued to the glide slope indicator. "Pull up. Terrain warning. Terrain. Pull up!" The synthetic voice of the plane's computer barked at them. "I know!" Richard screamed. He yanked back on the yoke. The plane cleared the ridge by less than 200 feet. The turbulence coming off the mountains hit them like a physical blow. The wings dipped violently, 40 degrees to the right. In the back, plates crashed in the galley. A bottle of expensive champagne exploded against the bulkhead. Vivienne closed her eyes. She thought of her daughter in medical school. She thought of the hospital wing she had just funded. And then she thought of the arrogant man flying this plane who had risked all their lives for a paycheck from the black market. "If we live," she vowed, "I will destroy him." 50 feet, Liam called out. 30, 20, flare. Richard cut the power. The $60 million jet slammed onto the runway with the grace of a brick. The tires screeched, smoking as the anti-skid system fought for traction on the cold asphalt. The plane bounced once, hard, tossing everyone against their restraints, before settling back down and shuddering violently. Richard slammed on the brakes and engaged the single thrust reverser. The roar was deafening. The plane skidded toward the left edge of the runway, threatening to plow into the snowbanks. "Right rudder! Right rudder!" Liam screamed. Richard stomped on the pedal. The nose swung back to the center. They slowed. 100 knots, 80 knots, 40 knots. Finally, the jet came to a halt at the very end of the runway, just feet from the turnaround pad. The engine whined down. The silence that followed was heavy and ringing. In the cockpit, Richard Sterling slumped forward, his forehead resting on the yoke. He was alive. He had landed it. But as the adrenaline faded, the cold reality rushed in. He was on the ground. The police would be here. The owner knew about the watches. He unbuckled his harness with frantic, fumbling fingers. "Richard, we need to run the shutdown checklist," Liam said, breathless. "Forget the checklist," Richard snarled. He scrambled out of his seat. "Get the door open." "What? We have to wait for the tug." "Open the damn door, Liam," Richard shouted, pushing past the confused co-pilot. Richard burst into the cabin. He looked wild, hair disheveled, tie crooked, sweat soaking his shirt. He didn't look at Vivian. He looked straight at the bedroom door. He needed the cases. If he could get the cases and run into the darkness, maybe he could hide them in a snowbank. Maybe he could claim he never saw them. He took 2 steps toward the back. "Sit down, Richard." The voice came from the divan. Vivienne was unbuckling her seatbelt. She stood up, blocking the aisle. The heavy Pelican case was at her feet. "Move!" Richard panted. His eyes were darting around like a trapped animal. "I need to check the damage in the rear." "There is no damage in the rear," Vivian said calmly. "Only the damage to your future." Through the windows, the flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles flooded the cabin, illuminating the terror on Richard's face. The main cabin door hissed open, and the cold mountain air rushed in, smelling of pine and unburnt jet fuel. Richard made a move. It was a desperate, stupid lunge. He tried to dive for the Pelican case at Vivienne's feet. "Don't!" Liam yelled from the cockpit doorway. Vivienne didn't flinch. As Richard reached for the handle, she simply stepped on his hand. She didn't stomp. She placed the heel of her sneaker on his fingers and applied pressure. Richard yelped and recoiled, clutching his hand. "You really thought you could rob me, insult me, and then crash my plane, all in one day?" Vivienne asked, looking down at him. "Dr. Dubois, please," Richard begged, dropping to his knees. The transformation was complete. The man who had stood on the stairs at Teterboro like a god was now kneeling on the carpet, broken. "I can explain. I can fix this. Just let me take the bag and go. You don't want the scandal. Think of the press. Billionaire's jet used for smuggling. It looks bad for you, too." "I don't care about the press," Vivian said coldly. "I care about the law." Boots clattered on the air stairs. "Police, everybody stay where you are." 3 officers from the Aspen Police Department, followed by 2 men in windbreakers with FBI emblazoned on the back, stormed the cabin. "Hands in the air!" Richard froze, his hands trembling as he raised them. Vivian calmly raised her hands as well, though her posture remained regal. "Officers," she said clearly, "I am Dr. Vivian Dubois. I am the owner of this aircraft. The man on his knees is the pilot, Richard Sterling." One of the FBI agents, a tall man with a stern face, stepped forward. "Dr. Dubois, we received a distress signal from your transponder, but we also got a call from New York Dispatch regarding a potential federal violation. Is everyone okay?" "We are physically unhurt," Vivian said. She pointed to the black case at her feet, and then to the open bedroom door where the other 2 cases were visible. "However, I believe you will find what you are looking for right there." The agent looked at the cases. "What is in the box, ma'am?" "I believe," Vivian said, her eyes locking onto Richard. "It is about $10 million in undeclared stolen luxury watches. Mr. Sterling was attempting to smuggle them into the country using my private exemption." Richard let out a sob. "I was forced! They made me do it!" "Cuff him," the agent ordered. 2 officers hauled Richard to his feet. They pulled his arms behind his back, the metallic click-click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent cabin. It was the sound of a career ending. It was the sound of a life imploding. "Liam," Richard cried out, looking at his co-pilot. Tell them I didn't know! You have to help me!" Liam shook his head, looking at the floor. "I didn't know anything, Richard. I just flew the plane." As they dragged Richard toward the door, he looked back at Vivian. His face was a mask of hatred and despair. "You ruined everything," he spat. "You think you're so special because you have money. You're nothing. You're just a—" "Get him out of here," the agent snapped, shoving Richard forward before he could finish the slur. Vivian watched him go. She didn't feel triumph. She felt exhausted. "Mom?" The FBI agent turned back to her. "We're going to need to take these cases into evidence, and we'll need a statement from you and the rest of the crew." "Of course," Vivian said. "Agent, before you take him away, there is one thing." "Yes?" "Check his pockets. He has my phone." The agent frowned, patted Richard down as he stood at the top of the stairs, and pulled out Vivian's cracked iPhone. He handed it back to her. "Thank you," she said. As Richard was led down the stairs into the flashing lights and the waiting news crews who had arrived for the crash landing but were staying for the arrest, Vivian walked to the door of the plane. She stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the tarmac. The rain of New Jersey was gone, replaced by the crisp, biting cold of Aspen. Richard was being shoved into the back of a squad car. He looked up and saw her. Vivian didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply stood there in her black t-shirt and sweatpants, looking down at him from the $60 million platform he had tried to kick her off of. She unlocked her phone and made one final call. "Marcus," she said, when the CEO answered. "Vivian, my God, I saw the news alert about the emergency landing. Is everyone safe?" "We are alive," Vivian said. "Marcus, Richard Sterling has just been arrested by the FBI for grand larceny and smuggling. He wrecked the landing gear and blew an engine." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "I want his pension frozen," Vivian said, her voice hard as diamond. "I want his severance voided for gross misconduct, and I want you to sue him for the damage to the aircraft." "Consider it done," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "Vivian, I am so sorry. And Marcus." "Yes." "Next time," Vivian said, watching the police car drive away with the man who had called her a stray. "Make sure your pilots know what the owner looks like, even when she's wearing a hoodie." She hung up. Vivian turned back to the cabin. Sarah was still sitting in the jump seat, looking traumatized. Liam was slumped in the cockpit doorway. "Liam," Vivian said. "Yes, Dr. Dubois," he asked, jumping to attention. "Can you fly this plane out of here once the engine is fixed?" "Yes, ma'am, absolutely." "Good," she said. "You're the captain now. Get a raise." She picked up her battered duffel bag. "Sarah, grab your coat. We're going to the hotel. I think we all need a very stiff drink." For the first time in 6 hours, Dr. Vivienne Dubois smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a survivor who had just watched the wolves eat the hunter. 6 months had passed since the incident on the tarmac at Teterboro and the terrifying descent into Aspen. For Richard Sterling, time had stopped the moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The fallout had been nuclear. The story hadn't just made the local news, it became a global sensation. The headline, "Billionaire Doctor Saves Crew While Pilot Smuggles Millions," trended for days. But the reality for Richard was far grimmer than a viral news cycle. He sat in the defendant's chair at the United States District Court in Denver, a ghost of the man he used to be. His silver fox hair was thinning, and his tailored uniform had been replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting suit. He had lost everything. Marcus Thorne and the management company had sued him for breach of contract and the damage to the jet, seizing his savings, his pension, and his condo in Miami. The FAA had revoked his license permanently. Assistant U.S. Attorney Miller stood before the jury, dismantling Richard's defense. "The defendant wants you to believe he was a victim," she said, pointing a finger at him. "But the evidence tells a different story. We have emails and texts going back 2 years. Mr. Sterling didn't just agree to smuggle $12 million in stolen watches, he orchestrated it. He used a $60 million aircraft as his personal getaway car." Richard stared at the table, unable to look at the gallery where Dr. Vivienne Dubois sat in the front row, impeccable in a white suit. Next to her were Liam, now captain of her fleet, and Sarah, the head of cabin services. They were a team. Richard was the outcast. The verdict came swiftly. "On count 1, smuggling goods into the United States," the foreman read. "Guilty. On count 2, transportation of stolen property. Guilty. On count 3, reckless endangerment. Guilty." Richard closed his eyes, swallowing a sob. During the sentencing hearing, Vivian walked to the podium to give her victim impact statement. The courtroom fell silent. She turned and looked directly at the disgraced pilot. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice calm but commanding. "For 20 years, you lived a life most only dream of. But it wasn't enough. You felt the need to belittle those you deemed beneath you. You judged me by the color of my skin and the hoodie on my back. You treated the owner of the plane like a trespasser." She took a breath. "I don't hate you, Richard. I pity you. You were so busy looking down on everyone that you forgot to look where you were landing. You crashed your life because your ego was too heavy for the plane to carry." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I ask for justice. Ground him." Judge Harrison nodded solemnly. "Richard Sterling, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. You are also ordered to pay $4 million in restitution." The gavel banged like a gunshot. As the marshals dragged Richard away, he looked back one last time, whispering a desperate apology. Vivian simply turned her back and walked out. 3 months later, the morning sun at Aspen-Pitkin County Airport was blindingly bright. The Bombardier Global 7500 sat on the tarmac, repaired and repainted, with a sleek midnight blue stripe. Vivienne stepped out of her Range Rover, wearing her favorite comfortable grey hoodie. At the top of the stairs stood Captain Liam, wearing 4 gold stripes and a warm smile. "Good morning, Dr. Dubois. We are fueled and ready." Vivian settled into the master recliner. She pulled out her phone and opened her email. She had one final piece of business to conclude. She had taken the settlement money from the lawsuit against Richard's management company and put it to use. She typed a message to the Dean of Tuskegee University. Subject: the Dubois Scholarship. Please find attached the endowment confirmation. This fund is to provide full scholarships for young pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. I want to ensure the next generation knows the sky belongs to everyone. She hit send. "We are ready for taxi, ma'am," Liam announced. "Destination: Paris." "Take us up, Liam," Vivian whispered. The engines roared to life, a smooth, powerful hum. The jet taxied past the spot where Richard had tried to kick her off, gathering speed until the wheels left the ground. Vivienne Dubois soared into the sky, leaving the weight of the past on the ground. The karma had been served, and finally, she was flying free. And that is the story of how one pilot's arrogance cost him his freedom, his career, and his dignity. Richard Sterling judged a book by its cover, never realizing that the woman in the hoodie was the one writing his paycheck, and eventually signing his prison sentence. It's a brutal reminder that in this life, Humility is free, but arrogance will cost you everything. You never know who you're talking to, and you never know when the tables will turn. Now, I have to ask you, if you were Vivian, would you have testified against him, or would you have just fired him? Do you think 15 years in prison was fair? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of high-flying justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching.